What if everything you were taught about one of the most powerful Native American nations was built on a lie? Not a small misunderstanding, but a fundamental centuries-old mistake that shaped history books, museum exhibits, and even Hollywood films. Before we go any further, if you care about history that actually tells the truth, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and share this video with someone who thinks they already know everything about Native American history. Trust me, they don't. Not yet. The Iroquois. The very name carries weight. These were the people who built a democratic confederacy so advanced that some historians believe it directly influenced the United States Constitution. They were warriors, diplomats, farmers, and storytellers. For centuries, European colonizers feared them, respected them, and tried desperately to control them. They were a civilization within a civilization, organized, sophisticated, and deeply rooted in the land they called home. But here is the question that scientists, historians, and archaeologists have been quietly arguing about for decades. Where did the Iroquois actually come from? Were they always there, in the northeastern woodlands of North America? Or did they migrate from somewhere else, long before Europeans ever arrived? And if they migrated, who did they replace? Who came before them? For a long time, the answers to these questions came from two places: oral traditions passed down through generations of Iroquois people and archaeological digs that uncovered bones, pottery, and tools. Both of these sources told important stories, but they also left enormous gaps. They left room for assumptions. And assumptions in history have a way of hardening into facts before anyone stops to check them. Then came ancient DNA. Over the last decade, advances in genetic technology have allowed scientists to extract and analyze DNA from human remains that are thousands of years old. This is not science fiction. This is real, and it is changing everything. For the Iroquois, the results of these genetic studies did not just fill in the gaps. They overturned what people thought they already knew. They revealed a story that is older, stranger, and far more dramatic than anything written in a textbook. To understand what the DNA revealed, you first need to understand what people believed before it arrived. The traditional academic view of Iroquois origins was something called the in situ model. In simple terms, this means that the Iroquois developed where they were found. They did not come from somewhere else. They evolved gradually, right there in the northeastern woodlands, over thousands of years. Their culture grew slowly from earlier populations that had lived in that region since the end of the last ice age. The pottery changed. The settlements got larger. The villages became more permanent. And eventually, around 1,000 years ago, the distinct Iroquois culture emerged. This model was appealing because it was tidy. It matched a certain romantic idea about native peoples being timeless, permanent features of their landscapes, almost as though they had always been there, inseparable from the forests and rivers around them. It was also politically convenient, because it meant no one had to ask uncomfortable questions about who the Iroquois might have displaced when they arrived, if they arrived at all. But not everyone agreed with this model. A competing theory, called the migration hypothesis, argued that the Iroquois came from somewhere else entirely. Some scholars pointed to linguistic evidence. The Iroquoian language family is completely distinct from the Algonquian languages, spoken by almost every other group surrounding them. This was strange. Languages do not appear out of nowhere. If the Iroquois had been in the northeastern woodlands forever, their language should show much deeper connections to the languages around them. Instead, it stood apart like a foreign word dropped into the middle of a familiar sentence. Some researchers even proposed that the Iroquois had migrated from somewhere in the interior of the continent, perhaps from the area around the Great Plains or the mid-continent river systems. This would explain the linguistic isolation. It would explain certain cultural similarities that seem to appear suddenly in the archaeological record. But it was still theory. Still speculation. There was no hard biological evidence to settle the debate. That changed when ancient DNA entered the picture. Researchers began extracting genetic material from skeletal remains found at archaeological sites across the northeastern United States and southern Canada. These were individuals who had lived in the region at various points over the last several thousand years. By comparing their genetic profiles to each other and to modern populations, scientists could begin to trace actual biological lineages. Not theories, not assumptions, but real genetic connections across time. What they found was extraordinary. The people buried at ancient sites in the northeastern woodlands before about 1000 CE showed a consistent genetic profile. They were related to each other. They shared ancestry that traced back to the populations who had first entered North America from Asia at the end of the Ice Age and had slowly spread across the continent. These were the descendants of the original settlers of the Northeast. They had been there for thousands of years, and the genetic record confirmed it. But then something changed. When researchers analyzed remains from later sites that were culturally associated with what archaeologists recognize as early Iroquois settlements, the genetic picture shifted. The DNA from these individuals was different. Not completely different, not alien, but measurably, statistically, undeniably different from the people who had lived in the same region just a few centuries earlier. This was not a case of one population slowly evolving in place. This was evidence of movement, of new people arriving, of a genetic signature that did not match the deep northeastern baseline. And this is where the story gets even more complicated and even more fascinating. The Iroquois themselves have oral traditions about their origins. These stories speak of a time of great conflict and suffering before the founding of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The name the Iroquois use for themselves, meaning people of the Longhouse. The oral traditions describe a period of war so brutal and endless that it seemed like civilization itself might collapse. Into this darkness came a figure known as the Peacemaker, a man of vision and wisdom, who traveled from nation to nation and convinced the warring peoples to lay down their weapons and join together under a single law, the Great Law of Peace. For a long time, many Western scholars treated these oral traditions the way they treated most indigenous oral history, as mythology, as poetry, as symbolic stories that conveyed cultural values but should not be read as literal historical accounts. But the DNA is forcing a rethink. Because if a genetically distinct group of people did arrive in the northeastern woodlands, around the time that Iroquois culture began to crystallize, if real migration did occur, then the oral traditions about conflict and transformation and the coming together of different peoples start to sound less like mythology and a lot more like memory. This is one of the most quietly revolutionary implications of the ancient DNA research. It is not just changing what scientists think about the Iroquois. It is changing how we think about oral tradition itself. It is suggesting that indigenous peoples preserved real historical information in their stories across hundreds and possibly thousands of years, information that science is only now beginning to confirm. Now pause for a second and think about what that means. How many other oral traditions have been dismissed as myth? How many other stories told by native peoples around campfires and in ceremonies were actually eyewitness accounts of events so old that no written record survived? Ancient DNA is not just a tool for understanding the past. It is a tool for learning to listen, really listen, to voices we have long ignored. And speaking of not ignoring things, or if this video is making you see history differently, you know what to do. Drop a comment below telling me one thing from your own culture's history that you think has been misunderstood or buried. Your perspective matters here. Let's build something real in the comments together. And while you're at it, make sure you're subscribed. The next video in this series goes even deeper. You do not want to be the person who missed it. The genetic evidence did not stop at simply confirming that new people arrived. It also raised questions about what happened to the people who were already there. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable. Because history, real history, not the sanitized version, is full of moments where one group of people moved into a space that another group of people already occupied. Sometimes this happened peacefully, sometimes through intermarriage and gradual cultural blending, sometimes through conflict and displacement, and sometimes through combinations of all three. The DNA evidence suggests that the original northeastern populations did not simply disappear when the ancestors of the Iroquois arrived. There is evidence of genetic mixing, of intermarriage and blending between the incoming group and the people already living in the region. This makes sense. Human beings have always been more complicated than the simple stories we tell about them. They trade, they marry, they adopt each other's children, they share food and stories, and eventually genes. But the incoming genetic signal was strong enough and distinct enough that it represents a real demographic shift. New people came. They brought new genes, new languages, and new cultural practices. And over the following centuries, the culture and the genetics of the region changed in ways that cannot be explained by in situ development alone. So the in situ model, the idea that the Iroquois simply evolved where they stood, is no longer scientifically tenable. Not completely. There was development in place, yes, but there was also movement. There was arrival. There was encounter. What is remarkable is that this does not diminish the Iroquois in any way. If anything, it makes their story richer and more human. Every civilization in human history has been shaped by movement and migration. The Romans were not always Roman. The Greeks were not always Greek. Every great culture in the world was built from a mixture of peoples who came together through war, through trade, through necessity, and created something new. The Iroquois are no different. Their confederacy, their great law of peace, their extraordinary political sophistication, these were not accidents. They were forged through exactly the kind of historical pressure and transformation that the DNA is now beginning to reveal. There's another dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it has to do with the timing of the DNA research and the politics surrounding it. Native American communities in the United States and Canada have historically had a complicated and often painful relationship with scientific research. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, Indigenous remains were excavated without consent, shipped to museums and universities, and studied without any regard for the beliefs or wishes of the living descendants. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 was a significant step forward. It gave tribes the legal right to reclaim remains and sacred objects held in federal institutions. But the damage done by centuries of scientific exploitation is not easily repaired. This history creates real tension around ancient DNA research. Some indigenous scholars and tribal leaders are deeply skeptical of genetic studies that seem to rewrite their histories without their participation. They point out, correctly, that genetics is not the only or even the primary way to understand identity and ancestry. They argue that who the Iroquois are is defined by culture, by law, by ceremony, by language, and by the living relationships within their communities, not by markers in a strand of DNA. These are legitimate and important arguments, and they deserve to be heard alongside the scientific findings. But here is what makes the current moment genuinely different. A growing number of researchers working in ancient DNA are making serious efforts to collaborate with indigenous communities, rather than simply extracting data from them. They are sharing findings before publication. They are seeking consent. They are working with tribal historians and oral tradition keepers to interpret the results in ways that are meaningful and respectful. This is not perfect, and it is not universal, but it is happening. And the result is a kind of knowledge that is more complete, because it combines the depth of genetic science with the depth of lived cultural memory. When those two things align, when the DNA and the oral tradition tell the same story in different languages, something extraordinary happens. History comes alive in a way that it simply cannot when it comes only from bones and data. The Iroquois story is becoming one of the most compelling examples of this convergence. The Great Law of Peace, the founding document of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of political philosophy produced anywhere in the ancient world. It established a system of representative government, protected individual rights, outlined procedures for decision-making, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. It did all of this centuries before the Magna Carta, centuries before the French Enlightenment, and long before the framers of the American Constitution gathered in Philadelphia. For generations, the sophistication of the Great Law was used as evidence against the migration hypothesis. The argument went like this: a people who had just arrived in a new land, who were still in conflict with existing populations, could not have produced something as complex and refined as the Great Law of Peace. That kind of political wisdom takes generations of settled, stable community life to develop. Therefore, the Iroquois must have always been where they were found. They must be in situ. But the DNA evidence, combined with a closer reading of the oral traditions, suggests a different interpretation. What if the Great Law of Peace was itself a response to migration and conflict? What if it was precisely the trauma and complexity of a period of movement and war, of different peoples colliding and struggling to coexist, that made such a radical political solution necessary? That would mean the Great Law of Peace was not born in stability. It was born in crisis. And that, honestly, makes it more impressive, not less. Because that is how transformative ideas are usually born. Not in peace and comfort, but in the middle of the hardest moments, when the old ways have broken down and something entirely new is needed. Let's take a step back and think about what all of this means for how we understand history itself. We live in an era of DNA revolution, not just for medicine, not just for ancestry websites that tell you what percentage Irish you are. Ancient DNA is rewriting the human story at a fundamental level. It is revealing migrations that left no written record. It is connecting populations across continents and centuries in ways that no archaeologist's shovel could ever uncover. It is demonstrating that human history is messier, more interconnected, and more dynamic than any map or textbook ever suggested. The Iroquois story is one chapter in this much larger revolution, but it is an important chapter, because it is a story about a people who have always been treated as static, frozen in time, frozen in place, by both their admirers and their enemies. And it is a story where the science is now saying, no, these people were moving. These people were changing. These people were encountering and transforming and being transformed, just like every other human civilization that has ever existed. And maybe that is the most important thing the DNA has revealed. Not just about the Iroquois, but about all of us. Human beings are not rooted. We are not fixed. We move, we mix, we change, and we create new things out of the collision of different worlds. The Iroquois did not become great because they stayed still. They became great because of what they did when everything was in motion, when the world was uncertain and dangerous and new. They created something that lasted, something that, in many ways, we are still living inside of. That is not a story about a people who were other than what we thought. That is a story about a people who were more than what we thought. Before we get to the final part of this story, let me do something a little different. I want you to think about someone in your life, a teacher, a parent, a friend, who once told you that history was settled. that the stories were already written, that there was nothing left to discover. This video is proof that they were wrong. Share it with them. Not to prove a point, but because this kind of discovery deserves more eyes on it. Real history is alive, and it belongs to everyone willing to look for it. Send this video to that person right now. Go ahead, I'll wait. The debate about Iroquois origins is not completely closed. Science rarely delivers clean, final answers. What the ancient DNA studies have given us is a much clearer picture. A picture that shows movement and migration, genetic mixing, population shifts, and a deep connection between the oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee people and the biological record preserved in ancient bones. There are still questions. Where exactly did the ancestors of the Iroquois migrate from? What was the precise nature of the encounter between the incoming population and the people already living in the northeastern woodlands? How long did the transition take? These are questions that future DNA studies, combined with more careful archaeological work and deeper engagement with indigenous oral traditions, will continue to investigate. But the central question, were the Iroquois always who we thought they were, has been answered. No, they were not the static, timeless, unchanging people of the textbook story. They were a dynamic, complex, migrating people who built one of the greatest political systems in human history out of the raw material of conflict, movement, and transformation. And here is what I want to leave you with. The story of the Iroquois is not just their story. It is a mirror. Every nation on earth was built by people who came from somewhere, who encountered someone, and who had to figure out how to live together or destroy each other. The Iroquois chose a third path, not simply coexistence, not war, but genuine political union. They chose to turn the difficulty of their shared experience into the foundation of something lasting. The great law of peace was not a miracle that fell from the sky. It was a human solution to a human problem. And the ancient DNA is now telling us that the problem it solved was even bigger and more complicated than we imagined. Because the people it united were not just culturally different. They were, in some meaningful way, biologically different as well. They had come from different places. They carried different histories in their bodies. And somehow, they built something together. That is the truth the DNA revealed. Not a smaller story. A bigger one. Not a simpler story. A more extraordinary one. The Iroquois were never who we thought. They were something far more remarkable.